ShARC presents Laura Jean McKay, author of The Animals in That Country, an online Q&A hosted on Tuesday the 26th of April 2022, 9 p.m. till 9:45 p.m.
Thanks for joining us today for the Q&A. A lot of you have been to the reading group previously to this, and we obviously had a lot of interesting points to say and a lot of questions that came out of that hopefully we can ask to Laura. So I just want to say thank you to Laura for joining us today to talk about your absolutely amazing book, The Animals in That Country. Everybody's really excited for you to join us today, so a big thank you. So what I'll do is I'll just sort of ask an initial question, get Laura to respond, and then we'll open it up to everybody else's questions. So one of the first question I'll ask is, I'm a big fan, and a lot of the other people in here as well were a big fan of sort of these scenes with the whales and sort of the characterization of the whales in the novel. So I'm wondering if you'd like to say a bit more about why you chose to think about whales and whale communication in the way you did, and why did you conceive that they would be sort of like existentialists, as it were, like trying to welcome people back home into the ocean?
Oh, thank you so much, Samantha. It's so wonderful to be here and lovely to see familiar faces and names of people who I've read and admired for so long. I firstly want to say hello from Turrbal and Yagara country, which is the traditional Aboriginal land that I'm on today. That's it's very important, especially in colonial Australia, to acknowledge the peoples of these lands and also to acknowledge the many lands that you all come from today. I know that we're dialing in from many different countries and places, and also so important to acknowledge land, because a lot of the stories that we write about are very, very centered on land and country. And I'm looking down because I'm just clutching my book for sort of a safety blanket. So the whale scene does really sort of take in land and sea, and weirdly it was something that came. The novel took about 7 years to write, really. 10 if you're being sort of broad about the the initial conceptualization of it. The whale scene came very, very early on. It was, I'm not entirely sure where it came from, but it was one of those sort of fully formed scenes that that sometimes comes in writing that didn't change that much. I did do a lot of work on it over the years, but really the scene was very much there from quite an early stage in the very, very messy early drafts of the novel. And fiction writers and fiction readers here will know that sometimes, especially when you're writing fiction, it just needs you just need a little fact, a little bit of information for your, the door of your imagination to open up and start to conceive of this whole world. And so I read that whales, at some point, way back when they were in a very different form, came out of the ocean on their strange legs and went about on land for quite some time. And then at some point, their bodies or their evolution and evolving brains went, actually, it's not so great up here. We're going to go back into the ocean. There was food there. Our bodies liked it better. It's just better back there. And so in the whale scene in The Animals in That Country, just for people who haven't read it, it's a scene where the two sort of protagonists, the human narrator and a dingo called Sue, go to the ocean, and they see a lot of people throwing themselves into the water. And at this stage in the novel, people have started to be able to communicate with animals. People are throwing themselves into the ocean, and many of them are dying. And it turns out that it's because there are whales in there. There are whales have come into the bay, and the humans can hear what the whales are saying. And a lot of what the whales are saying is, come home. We're ready for you. We've made the bed, kind of thing. The windows are clean. Come home, come home. And it's not it's not insidious. It's not evil on the whale's part. The whales are in this scene are actually saying it's better in here. Come back to the ocean. We all came from here in the first place, but not realizing that human bodies aren't haven't evolved. They're not ready for the water, and so of course some of the humans meet their demise. And it was a scene, I think, that for me, as a writer, sort of was something that the entire novel needed to build up from and fall away from. It is the pivotal scene, even though it doesn't really come towards the end. And so it was something that when I was trying to work through the many ideas of how the human characters were to communicate with other animals in the text, the many difficulties of human, non-human animal relationships, and the embedded violence in that, the great difficulties of trying to put non-human animal dialogue on the page. The whale scene was there, and I thought, okay, I can do this. That's there, and that's something that I can work towards. If I've done this little scene of a few pages, maybe I can do 200 more pages of this.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear, Laura. And as well, in the reading group, Vera brought up that little fact about the whales as well, sort of coming out and going back in. So it's really cool to hear you sort of like confirming that as well. So has anyone got any other questions to ask, either about the whales or a separate question?
I'm so glad, Vera, because I'm always, I read that fact so long ago, and I'm always wondering if someone will correct me on it. But if it is the case, I'm pleased.
Yeah, so if people want to use the raise hand function, and then I can just call you out. Yeah, Mo.
Thank you. And thank you, Laura, for coming, especially because it's so early where you are. Really enjoyed the novel, and the discussion that we just had about it as well was a testament to how interesting it is, that it just raises so many questions about human-animal relationships and communication. And now I'm going to ask you about the human protagonist. I'm really interested in Jean and hearing more about how you develop that character, and why you chose her perspective for the novel.
Oh, thank you, Charlotte. Jean took a long time to arrive. She went through many iterations. She was a young woman who worked in a laboratory. There's always a young woman who works in a laboratory in eco-fictions. Nothing wrong with it, but she wasn't carrying the novel. She was a middle-aged man who just sat on a couch for a very long time, and it was really hard to get him moving. She was a cat at one point. And I realized that I needed someone who could carry the weight of this particular apocalypse. And I realized that who could do that better than a middle-aged woman. She's been through a crappy relationship. She finds it really hard to connect with other humans. She prefers other animals. She loves her drinks and her smokes and her cars. And it seemed that she had gone through enough that she could bear the weight of what I knew was going to be a very heavy novel. And she actually came along after I'd been quite ill for quite a long time, and so I was doing a lot of work from bed, and I was reading a short story by Ottessa Moffett called Bettering Oneself, and it's about a school teacher who has an alcohol dependence and yet keeps on teaching. And I just thought the voice of that, and this person who's able to carry on despite many sort of crutches and foibles was a really, really exciting voice. And so that really changed things for me. And also the fact that I was quite ill probably influenced Jean's voice a lot. I wasn't able to drink anymore. I wasn't able to take to the highway, with a smoke in one hand. So, I really got her out on the road and got her doing things in a way that I wasn't able to. Another factor that brought Jean about was that I got a writer's residency right up in the north of Australia, in the Northern Territory, which is like going to a completely different country from where I'm from. I'm from the south, and this was very far north, and I was living in a caravan in a wildlife park, surrounded by captive animals, many of whom had been rescued, but they were institutionalized, and also wild animals. So at night I would hear the sounds of the barking owls who were captured in their enclosure. And barking owls in Australia sort of go hoof hoof. They make a barking sound. It's quite beautiful. And then up above, their wild counterparts would call down to them hoof hoof. So I was hearing these two states, and in a way, Jean, comes from that life. She works at a wildlife park. The wildlife park very much influenced the setting of the novel, and also, and I can talk about this now or in a moment, it very much influenced how I brought Sue about as well, in terms of her personality in that institutionalized and wild state. Should I talk about Sue while I'm on
Yeah,
that?
I think that would be great. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Sue was one of those characters who just arrives on the page, and I didn't really expect her to come or necessarily invite her, but once she got there, she made sense of Jean for me, and the novel sort of really took off. Well, I had Jean, and I knew that I had a novel there, but once Sue arrived, that was when things really started to happen. And there were 3 captive dingoes in the wildlife park, and one female who didn't want a bar of me. And so, of course, as a human, I'm like, oh, you're interesting. You don't want to know me. I want to pursue you. She was really fascinating. But dingoes in Australian consciousness hold a really interesting place. We, humans love to categorize, and we just can't pin them down. They're wild, they're feral, they're pets, they're dangerous, they're sweet. There are so many. They're native, they're introduced, because they only came to Australia about, I think it's about around 6,000 years ago. So there's a lot of confusion about the dingo, and so she was really, really important to the novel because she like Jean, they both sort of embody the sort of confusion we have around older people, around dingoes, around female characters. And when I was writing Sue, I wanted to capture the institutionalized side of her and the wild side of her, and that comes out in the dialogue on the page. So Sue will often sort of say one thing like, pat me, and then in brackets, in parentheses, she'll say, I'm going to bite you. So she's constantly sort of living the institutional and this sort of this freer sort of more natural side. And that came from spending time with dingoes in the park. They're so soft. Their pelt, they have this huge ruff, and their pelt is just extraordinary. And I was cuddling up to one, and a ranger walked past me and said, "That's a wild animal there. That's not a puppy dog." That's, she's completely, she goes for walkies every day and things like that, but she will become wild in a second, and we will not be able to blame her for that. So, just be, you know, there's teeth in that rough kind of thing. And that was really helpful for me to understand that. I guess I bring Sue into this related to your question, Charlotte, because I think they have similar trajectories. People have sort of called them the Thelma and Louise of of animal books. You know, as I said, Jean has had a difficult past, the crappy divorce, the drinking. But Sue has also had a crappy past as well. She was found with her brothers and taken from the place she was born and put into show life for the rest of her life. She's looked at every single day, you know, and that's a very hard and traumatic state to live with. She's become very used to it. That's her life now. She lives there, but you know, she's really trying to cope with the fact that she's, you know, she did have a wild life and now she's been put into this large enclosure and then suddenly freed. And how does she cope with all of this freedom? It's shocking. So they're two females of their species coming together in states of various trauma and finding each other there, and then sort of moving past each other and missing each other completely in a way. That's a very long answer to your lovely question.
That was great, Laura. Susan, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you, Laura, so much for giving us insight into where this story came from. I'll confess right up front, I've fallen in love with Dingo Sue. I haven't fallen this hard for a character in a very long time. But, and that said, in the reading group, the conversation led me to reveal that I don't really understand her either. Like, I read aloud some of her lines thinking, maybe because I'm a stupid person, and yeah, maybe all kinds of possibilities there. But I also think that you've allowed her to be super complicated in a way that people don't let dog characters become. And that it's because she's not just a dog, she's Dingo Sue, that she is, like you said, inhabiting all these contradictions along the way. I could talk about dogs forever, so I'm not going to do that. I don't need you to keep talking about dogs either. But one question that came up, and it was from a comment that Kaori made in the discussion, was how you've set it up in a way that's very different from most pandemic novels, because the virus actually inhabits the story. The virus is there as a presence. So many pandemic novels, and I know you've had a lot of questions about pandemic novels, so it was a great reminder that you were thinking about this long before the rest of us were thinking about it. Could you talk about how you invented the disease and what you were thinking about that as a presence in the novel?
Sure. Firstly, I should say that it's actually yours and Robert McKay's fault that you know, if any of the characters are the way they are, because, you know, both of your writings were so influential. So yeah, it's completely your fault. Yeah, I just to address the Dingo Sue, I know what you mean, and I did want to keep. I don't understand Sue either, and it was really hard to retain that. You know, as a writer, you want to answer the questions, and you know, you're going to publish this, you're going to have to talk about it. Of course, you need to completely know your characters, but I needed to retain that wonderment, especially with Dingo Sue. She was a character who always just eluded me, and it was really important to me and the publisher that she remain that way, and that was so hard to allow her to be that on the page. Pandemic, I think it's such a disappointing answer because it's so technical, but it might not be disappointing to this group. I needed a whole heap of characters to all be able to speak to other animals or understand what other animals were communicating all at once. And the best way to do that, and the easiest way to do that, is for a lot of people to become sick. It's a horribly sort of technical, sort of way to go about it. But the other sort of deeper thing about it is that I had been bitten by a mosquito in Indonesia, and she had, with a mosquito, it was a tiger mosquito, and she bit, and then it was the lick. Apparently, it's the lick that transfers the disease. And I was ill for around 2 years, and the first 6 months of that, I was bright red. My skin peeled off my body. I was completely delirious. I got polyarthritis. I could barely move. So, picking up a cup of tea felt like every bone in my hand was breaking. And so I was so ill, but because I'm an idiot, I kept writing my novel when I could move. And so I was very sick, and I was developing these strange symptoms, and so delirious that the only thing I could come to terms with was that I was turning into a mosquito. I was like, okay, I'm turning into a mosquito. That's the only explanation for this. I can settle into it now that I've found the reason for this strange disease. But as I was becoming ill, the characters in the novel became ill as well, and started to get these strange symptoms. And as I was trying to research the disease that I had, it was called chikungunya. Not much was known about it in Australia at the time, even though other people in the world have experienced it. So I was writing I was looking at Wikipedia a lot, and then so I created this fake Wikipedia page for what I termed zoo flu, zooanthropathy, just to sort of have some fun with it and try to come to terms with what I was going through physically. So on the one hand, it was just a very technical decision. Great, that'll be handy for a whole heap of people to for a pandemic or an epidemic to sweep through the novel and they all get sick. But also I was, physically going through what Jean and other characters were starting to experience. And because my symptoms seemed so extraordinary, it didn't seem out of the question that extraordinary symptoms would be occurring in the novel as well. And quite interesting and nice ones, like the ability to be able to communicate with other animals, even if that turns out to be difficult.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Laura. David, did you have a question?
Hi, Laura. I absolutely love your
David.
book.
So nice to see you.
Yeah, no, it's so nice to see you too. It was a while since I read the book, and I just started rereading it again over the last few weeks because I knew the reading group was coming up. But yeah, I suppose for me, like, the big thing is for me was wondering with this book was what it was like to kind of give a voice to the animals, because and using the form you use, because I know Vera was talking about it as well, because I know she does poetry, and that was kind of how I viewed it as well. But how do you kind of manage to kind of fit all these kind of this really different animal world into this language, and put it through like kind of nearly human like translation? I think you described like all the different ways it's being translated, but how do you do that? And like, why did you choose like the form you did? And was it very difficult to do that? Like, you use like enjambment, parentheses, all these different things to kind of capture different like parts of the mind. And I just found that really interesting. So I was just hoping you could talk a bit about that.
Thank you. So the animal language, I guess, or animal dialogue, I guess we could call it, really did come from the mosquito. I was contemplating mosquitoes a lot and insects quite a bit. I'd experienced the extraordinary power of the insect and what an insect could do when it shares some of itself with you. And so I thought, I'd written I rewrote the novel completely 3 times. And on around the second draft, I showed my partner, who said, this talking animal novel is great, but there are no talking animals in it. I completely silenced them. And it was just my horror. I was doing my PhD. I was very sort of early career academic, and I had this horror of anthropomorphism, which a lot of people sort of go through before they realize that anthropocentrism is really the problem. Anthropomorphism is just our basic, very limited human way of relating to other animals. And so I've been very sort of silenced and silencing around that. But I was thinking, well, how would an insect speak or communicate? How does their body communicate? And I thought about the blowfly. When a giant fly, you know, comes into your house in the summertime and just flings itself against the windows, and suddenly the whole room becomes the sound of this fly inside. And I thought, oh, that seems quite joyous to me. And so it's sort of an expression of, even if they're feeling trapped, you know, their bodies are really expressing this very sort of this joyful presence. And as a writer, I conceived of that on the page as all caps. You know, sometimes all caps are thought of, especially in internet culture, as yelling, but maybe that could be joyful as well. It could be, you know, a loud expression. So once I had all caps for insects, that sort of released me to start to explore other sort of font and poetic techniques. And so I was looking at italics for birds. Maybe they have a certain nuance in their speech where on every line a certain word is in italics. And for Sue, as I mentioned before, because she has this wild and contained self, she has her wild self comes in parentheses, which is actually quite odd when I think of it like that. I should have analysed that. I should analyse that a little more. I captured the wild self in these little marks, and I let the institutionalized self be free, which is quite interesting as a human interaction. I still wanted to contain her, even as I wanted her to be wild. So that, yeah, there was a great freedom in that. And in a way, that animal dialogue is I almost think of it as a separate novel, or a lot of people call it poetry. I sort of think of it almost as song lyrics. I purposefully made it a little awkward, the way that song lyrics can be. I imagined the animals as sort of almost singing with their bodies. I purposefully tried to avoid making their language prophetic, too poetic, as having the answers to any human needs or questions. They were living their own life, even as they were responding to the human dialogue. They were living their own lives completely separate from the human characters, that had nothing to do with them until the humans inevitably interacted and invaded their world. So I do almost think of it as a separate thread, almost running alongside this human novel that needed to be, for me, very distinct, and yet in English, which is the only language that I speak.
Thanks, Laura. That was the perfect answer. But yeah, it's that thing of, like, you know, trying to like put it into English, and what you said just there at the very end, being it the only language you kind of speak, and that's the only way we can really translate it, which is kind of a weird thing to wrap your head around. Because I'm trying to do something similar right now, and I'm using parentheses for capturing things that the animals specifically wouldn't have, but using like a human word for it. I'm just like I'm just trying to like figure out like different ways of going at it. So like I find your novel like a really interesting way to kind of look at that way, and kind of trying to find my own way. So yeah, but thank you so much.
Oh, no problem. And the concept of translation is interesting there. I was because, well, in this novel, it is all mediated through the human experience, and so it is only ever translated through Jean's interpretation of what she's seeing. So at the very beginning, when she starts talking to Sue, she understands that Sue is calling her queen. It's very imperialistic, and which is sort of relates to Jean as a colonial settler character. And as she goes on and starts to get to know Sue, she realizes Sue might not be saying queen. She might be saying mother. She might be saying bitch. She might be saying lickspittle. She's, it changes.
Thanks, Laura. I'm really glad we've been able to hear more about the writing process, because that was something that I was really interested in as well. So thanks, David, for bringing that up. So Vera, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Sam. Thank you, Laura, very much. Just to add a bit to what you said earlier before I asked my question, I did sort of interpret the animal speech as poetic, but also because it is a separate thread, we've got the separate fonts. I was wondering whether there was something about how animal perception works in conjunction with breath, and not necessarily drawing physical breath, but all the senses, and where they stop to kind of gather more information, and how that information is fragmented and kind of reassembled in sort of animal mind, perhaps. There might be something that I don't know. That's probably something that you could address. And just one more thing that I wanted to mention is that I read the whole novel sort of from the perspective of country, with country in mind, with a capital C, and because of that, I feel that the magic of the disease is just so well placed. The setting itself for me is just so natural, if you could use that word. But also, I was wondering whether Deborah Bird-Rose is Wild Dog Dreaming influenced you in any way. So that's basically my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll start with, Deborah Bird-Rose's book absolutely was an influence. I mean, her work is just so huge, to many people all over the world, but especially in Australia. In a way, oddly, I leaned probably more on Val Plumwood's work and her idea of being prey, and also of the speaking meat, because I was very, very obsessed with interspecies communication, and Plumwood had so addressed that, and was also so connected to the idea of animals on country, and the different ways that we conceive the idea of danger and ourselves as meat. But yeah, Deborah Bird-Rose, that work was certainly influential in there. Probably almost, I just enjoy her writing. So I think I enjoyed her writing too much in a way that I forgot to study it enough. It's just so extraordinary. But Plumwood was more where I leant in terms of the theory. Your first question, is that sort of related to bodily communication? Is that what you mean by the breath? Is it sort of more about the poetic breath on the page?
It's kind of both. I pay particular attention to form in my own writing and musicality, and I was trying to maybe apply some of that to the way in which the sort of animal dialogue works here. But it is the actual breath. Obviously, these animals speak with their entire bodies, but perhaps something about how they perceive the world, not necessarily in sniffing it, but we get sight, a whiff of something that we can't. It's goes beyond human senses, and hearing something that we perhaps can hear, and going beyond that, sort of transcending. But then it obviously comes out in this weird and wonderful form in the novel. So I think that's kind of where I was going with that.
Yeah, I mean, the way I conceive of it is that at the start, the humans really struggle to understand what the animals are communicating. They're just almost they're not hearing, but they're sort of seeing little words come out, and so I think of it when it always seems to come back to canines. So if we have a dog or a dingo, and the dingo swishes its tail and lets out a fart and scrapes a paw, and an ear twitches, and a pheromone comes out, and then something's happening in the smell processing center, and these are sort of releasing, and it's intentional. The human characters aren't using telepathy to communicate with the animals. It's whatever the animals actually intentionally want to communicate. But all of these things, come out as sort of separate little words. But once the humans get to know and really pay attention to the whole animal, then they start to see or conceive of sentences and whole phrases. So it's sort of about a a stepping back and being quiet, but also a leaning in and looking at the animal as a whole being, you know, which is also around our ideas of animals as bits. You know, we see and understand animals as lots of bits in our world of meat or other products that we use, and it was about sort of seeing the whole living creature as a communicating being. So that was how I imagined that worked in the novel. In terms of the way that the animals are seeing themselves, I mean, in a way that sort of purposely remains mysterious, I think, because it is whatever they're intentionally trying to communicate, just like I'm intentionally trying to communicate here, even if I'm not doing so well sometimes. Yeah, I mean, they're just living their lives, of course. And when I was up in the Northern Territory, there are these extraordinary, I don't know what sort of ants they are. I did know and I've forgotten. There are these extraordinary fields up there of ant hills, and the ant hills are sort of almost flat, like tombstones. So you're driving along the road and you'll see what look to be a whole, you know, many, you know, maybe 50 tombstones all in this dry sort of field, and they're actually ant hills. And, you know, there are whole cities and whole worlds. The ants are just living out their lives with absolutely no need of or consideration of me, unless I, you know, go and poke it or you know, do a stupid human thing, drive into it accidentally or something, you know. And that was so wonderful to me that they had absolutely no need of the human world, and partly that influenced that that bodily sort of agency. And yeah.
Thanks, Laura, for that. Danny, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, Laura. Just to first say how much I loved the book, and it was a book I was quite nervous about reading, because as soon as I heard the, you know, the kind of the subject matter, I was like, this isn't going to be easy. But I really enjoyed it. I guess my question is kind of going back to what Vera was talking about your influences. But I mean, as someone, like, I'm researching, you know, animals on road trips, animals on the road, and this kind of thing. And I just was thinking about what you were saying earlier about, you know, how Jean obviously loves her cars, and, you know, there's this whole kind of, you know, kind of Dingo and Jean road trip bit, which gets them to the beach, basically, which I know you were talking about Thelma and Louise earlier, and it's quite an interesting parallel. And it just got me thinking about the line in the Margaret Atwood poem, you know, from which you take the title. Like, in this country, the animals have the faces of animals. Their eyes flash once in car headlights and are gone. And I was just wondering if there was anything to kind of say to that point. And if I'm reading too much into that line, then I'd just like to ask a more general question about how that poem in particular influenced the work.
Yeah, I came across that poem, you know, when I was fairly far into writing the novel, and it was just one of those. I mean, I love Atwood's poetry. I don't think it gets enough attention, but it was just one of those pieces that just really sort of makes things click. And it was particularly the lines, you know, in this country, the animals have the faces of animals, and later on in this country, the animals have the faces of humans, or maybe it's the other way around in the text. I can't remember, but I like the idea that that we sometimes see animals with our own faces on them, and we sort of plaster our faces on, and then when it serves us, we, you know, they have the faces of animals, and they can be distinct from and very different from us, and we can either celebrate that or abuse it. You know, I mean, Atwood's poem is really about roadkill. So, you know, I was sort of analysing it for my own purpose, but yeah, it was such a lovely and interesting idea there, I thought. In terms of the road, you know, the road movie, I mean, I was so disappointed when I realised that I was writing a road novel, because it's a very Australian thing to do. There's a lot of roads. It's a very big place. You have to take roads to get places and for a very, very long time often. And so, you know, when they were suddenly these characters were on the road, I thought, oh no. So I really needed to work with and on that to make it a different sort of road movie. And I suppose the very fact that it was a human and a dingo talking to each other and getting to know each other, you know, that helped in that way. Was that your question? I can't quite remember. I got carried away and
Not to make any kind of question, to be honest. So yeah,
but Danny, did you have another question embedded in there that I've missed?
No, that pretty much clears it up. I was just, yeah, we talked quite a lot about this with the kangaroo and the joey as being like a particularly emotive one in the reading group. So I just wanted to raise something along those lines, basically. Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned that Atwood's poem is actually about roadkill, which, yeah, obviously. No, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, oh yeah, no problem. I mean, I'm glad you bring up the kangaroo, because part of the Australian experience on the road is the killing of animals by car. It is actually very hard to go on a long road trip without either, well, you encounter this everywhere, but also physically making this happen. This happens all the time, no matter how careful you are. So it was impossible not to. I mean, for Australians, it would almost be a hitting a kangaroo scene, you know, how original, because it's just so prevalent. But of course I had to have that in there, and I had to also have a moment where Jean could actually understand what this dying kangaroo was saying, because it is a moment that almost anyone who's been on a long road trip in Australia has experienced. But, you know, when do we get to, you know, hear their dying communication? So it was a very important scene to include there. And I think one of the rare scene, apart from the slapping of insects, I'm not remembering my own novel here, but I think it is one of the rare moments in the novel of an animal death, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, for people who've read it more recently than me. But it was also important for me not to have a book where, you know, animals just die all the way through it, even though that is very much part of our reality. It was important to have animal presence in the novel, not just animal death, even though I think there are novels who you know, very much need to address that. But this was a novel about animal presence. And, you know, I get so shitty when I see a movie. I've gone to see a movie and there's a dog, and if the dog is sort of like an important part of the movie at the start, I call it Chekhov's dog. You know that dog is going to die by the end as a symbol of the man's loneliness, you know. And it really it really bugs me. And I didn't want Chekhov's dog. I wanted the animals mostly to survive. So the kangaroo scene is important in that way, because it is that moment of death, and yeah, one of the only moments, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. It's really interesting that you mentioned the fact that you didn't want to obviously kill off Sue at the end. That's something that Brett raised in the reading group, as he said he was sort of expecting that to be the end. I think it's really interesting how you sort of changed that expectation. I was going to do Kari's question, but she seems to have left. So we're sort of getting towards, oh, she's back now. So maybe we can do this as the last question. Kari, did you still want to ask your question? Okay, I'm not sure she's there. So it's sort of 8:45 now, so that would usually be the end. So thank you so much, Laura, for joining us. Obviously, I know it's really early there for you, so thank you so much for getting up early. I just want to say a big thank you to everybody who's come to the Q&A in the reading group today. Obviously, it's later in the evening, so I really appreciate everybody making the time to come to that tonight. There's just been a really great discussion. It's been really good to hear your answers for the Q&A, Laura. And just again, thank you for sharing all of those answers about your really brilliant book. So thanks to everybody.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's such an amazing way to start the day with all of you. I think we should get together tomorrow. And yeah, thank you for your kind and thoughtful questions. Yeah, and for your amazing work as well, which has been so influential to me.
Right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks so much.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank once again Laura Jean McKay for being part of today's Q&A. It was really interesting to hear all of your insightful answers to the brilliant questions asked by our attendees. Today's Q&A has been part of the ShARC monthly reading group. If you'd like to get involved and attend, please contact either Mo O'Neill or myself, Samantha Hind, via the emails displayed on screen. If you'd like to find out more about ShARC, the Sheffield Animal Studies Research Centre, please go to the website displayed on screen or follow us on Twitter @ChefAnimals. Thank you for joining us today.